We are continuing our study in the Gospel of Matthew and find ourselves today at Matthew chapter 3 and verse 6. I will be reading from the Message translation, Matthew 3:6. There at the Jordan River, those who came to confess their sins were baptized into a changed life. The history of baptism in Judaism is not clear. What do we mean? We know the early church practiced the rite of baptism, but its prehistory is a little unclear in Judaism. Judaism, of course, had a long history of ceremonial washings. So a couple of quick Old Testament examples we can use are found in Exodus chapter 19 and verse 10, or we could turn to Leviticus chapter 8 and verses 6 to 9. In the New Testament era, hand washing was a very involved procedure, and Jesus got in trouble with the religious establishment over his non-practice of their ritual hand washing. So, for example, you can see Luke chapter 11 and verse 38. The Qumran community, or what we know as the community that was at the Dead Sea, the people who gave to us the Dead Sea Scrolls, were one group in Judaism that practiced an elaborate washing ceremony. Now, Qumran and the early church are not interconnected in spite of what people want to say. But there is a connection in the sense that they both come out of the same stream, that is Judaism. So we can see there is this prehistory to Christian baptism and Judaism where washing is an important part of the faith. There is some reason to believe that baptism became a procedure by which a person who was converting to Judaism from outside the faith would be baptized. The baptism of John, in that sense, was not unique, but seems to have taken the idea of immersion and washing to a new level. The important point to remember is that when John began to baptize people, he was using a rite that had its antecedent in the procedure used for converts to Judaism. You catch that? If there was any knowledge of baptism in the pre-Christian era, it was for somebody outside the faith, not within. In that way, it is very different from the Christian notion of baptism. Yes, Christian baptism is used at conversion, but it is also a defining rite of the church. So notice here, I'm not talking about adult or infant baptism. I'm talking of adult baptism. So when John was out there baptizing Jews, he was making a very loud statement about who they were before God. The great issue that Jesus and the early church dealt with was the question of what made a person of the faith. In Judaism, the simple story, we could say that a person was Jewish because of ethnicity and, more broadly speaking, a culture, a religious culture, but it was still a culture. The early church put the emphasis on actual faith. So you can see Colossians 2:11 or Romans 9:6. Now, this is not all just academic information. It has implications for how we understand evangelism. Evangelism is all too often presented as reaching out there. Evangelism, in that sense, is what is practiced outside the church. It is practiced outside the church, for the church is the home of the Christian. Here we are getting caught up in semantics. If we mean the church is the body of Christ, then we are talking of those who have accepted Christ and are living their lives for Christ. The problem is in the confusion between the church as the body of Christ, which is not one and the same with the church in the institutional sense. One of the reasons that we need to do evangelism in the church is because not everybody in the church is actually a part of the church that is the body of Christ. You see, people are in church for all sorts of reasons, and not all of them are necessarily good. If we want to impact our world for Christ, then we need to start in the church. That's where John's baptism began, in the people of Israel. What made the work of John successful? Was it the message he proclaimed? Was it the fact that he was a snappy dresser? It was the fact that the time was right. The reality and the fact that people saw their need. In that sense, we could say that the reality is that there was a convergence of many things. John baptized and preached, but God had been working in the people. There was a hunger and perceived need for a work of God in their lives. There are moments in history like this. I know that people have tried to explain why this happens. I'm not sure we can come up with one definitive answer as to why it was. If John was willing to baptize, was not willing to baptize, would it have happened? If you are Christian, you long for that great move of God. It is why we do church week after week, for we never know when God will move in a mighty way.